Hello guys! Welcome back to Not Just Mecha! It's Marco here, and today we are aiming for the apotheosis of speed painting, working at the same time on 5 extremely different Cities of Sigmar color schemes, and tying everything together as a single coherent warband. I have a deep fascination for the humble, weak and short-lived human being casting crazy fantasy and sci-fi worlds. Literally everything is deadlier and more powerful. But it's from the hopelessness of the very bottom of the food chain that true heroes and cool stories rise. Identifying with these underdogs is easy and visceral. And the concept itself has the potential for infinite different takes and angles on how humans can survive and even prosper in these unforgiving universes, of which we have some great examples in the new Cities of Sigmar book. I'll be honest, the concept of this 5 cities kill team, also known as the medieval Power Rangers, came mostly from my excitement for their lore, and the impossibility of choosing a single homeland for my guys. So why not take inspiration from real history, and go with the Landskeneck colorful and flamboyant style of uniform? And as a plus, we get to work on the interesting challenge of making extremely different schemes, not only fast and efficient by themselves, but also harmonious and coherent with the others. That's a concept that you can use with a great visual effect, even on army scale, on many less organized forces, like Skaven, Undead, Ogres, Orcs and Greenskins in general, Genestealer Skulls, Chaos Cultists, that technically shouldn't have factory-made, mass-produced uniforms. So don't be afraid of variety, because I can assure you, with a bit of extra planning and understanding of how light works, it can be achieved pretty quickly, and look at the same time both incredibly rich and super tight. You probably already noticed that I sneaked into the build a few old school beats from the Empire range, and they work like a charm in the 28mm scale of these new humans, that, for my taste, need more puffy sleeves and fancy hats. If you have an old Empire force, you can field it seamlessly next to the new releases. So, here is the first game-changing speed/army painting trick. If true metallic bits are even slightly more than a few small spare inserts here and there, start the work by painting all the metals. Metallic paints are almost impossible to completely tame when airbrushed, and even a subtle overspray becomes a sprinkle of shiny glitters impossible to blend or hide. And even working with the brush, they tend to be less flowy and playable than standard paints. So I tend to settle the messier stage of basic metals as soon as I can, and then I fix their borders and edges using the opacity of the next stages and their tones. And same idea for the more colorful metallic shades that will come later. In this particular case, this method also cuts a lot of working time, minimizing the need for fixes with several different colors from the specific palettes of the contrasting heraldries. These models are small. For the modern GW standard, these models are really small. So, as much as I love to begin with a sprayed black and white value sketch and a sharp bitonal high contrast zenithal light, because of this tiny scale, I cannot really get much from that approach. That delivers way better results on larger areas, where the stretch development of the grayscale builds up way more information and more gentle progressive shades. So this time I opt for a more efficient dark to light layering that, combined with the intrinsic output of the airbrush and a few smoothing dirty tricks, will deliver the full progression of lights and shadows in just 3 steps. This first application represents my mid-level intermediate shadows, for sure darker than the midtones that will come later, but in general not too light and not too deep, to leave some working space to oil paints. But the really interesting thing here is the selection of tones I'm using. Looking for a coherent render of a setting and its environmental light, the local colors of the outfits and their midtones are the least important part of the flow, because they are the only element not coming from the environment. So the light casted over the local hues and the shadow it projects under them is the key. Here I plan to end on a melancholic, warm, desaturated light. So, for pure contrast, I'm starting with a cold, more saturated shadow on every model. Violet becomes the base and shadow for the Hammeral orangey red. Blue, the foundation for both the Living City yellow-green and Lethy's warm purple. And a reddish violet-brown is the stepping stone for the yellow progression of grey water fastness. And since I'm here with a loaded airbrush, I use the same brown to base the skins. As we'll see later, the blue of Settler's Gain is a bit different, because following the lore, I want it a bit more elvish style, pure and clean. But it follows the same concept for the flow of temperatures. From here, I jump directly into the light mid-tones and upper mid-values of the main local colors. I aim to the center of the major shapes, and I leave the overspray free to roughly blend itself with the previous more solid and opaque layer. Simple as that. As mentioned, the only exception is the blue, that I prefer to shade with the darker ink. In terms of values and steps, the result is the same, with a final output made of a block of shadows and a block of midtones, but with a combination of the more solid central tone and the super saturated shadow, I get a more vibrant finish that calls back to the elven rulers of this city of the Realm of Light. A quick pass of a basic light skin tone sets the first rough modulation of the few patches of naked skin, basically just faces and hands. And the neutral tone of some transitional secondary bits, like trousers and light leather. and I use a tiny bit of pure white to highlight skulls, bones and scrolls, and the frame for the heraldic symbols on the shields, to give them a subtle spotlight effect. As mentioned, the first stage of sprayed metallics was just a way of setting a foundational metallic finish for the armors, not really their color. So, as all the other parts at this stage, they need a first level of shadows that I also use to show their different origin and character. Brown and black, mixed with a basic mid-value silver, are natural choices for the greasy, industrial environment of grey water. As much as green and turquoise for armors forged in the more environmentally friendly living city. I use different temperatures of blue to shade the clean equipment from Settler's Gain. And brown and yellow ink to instantly turn the silver into a variety of gold and bronze shades. A mix of blue and magenta, supported by a slightly darker silver, to push on the gloomy theme of Lethis. And a more generic, jack-of-all-trades palette for Harrenhal, that I feel like the standard, baseline look of this army. To compensate for the less unique shades, I play a bit more with the internal variety, using a darker black metal on the shield, and a more knightly bluish render on the armor. This stage is really fun and forgiving, and there's no limit to how rich and colorful you can make the metals, especially on heroes and big models. Here I'm sticking to 1 or 2 tones per figure, only for the sake of speed and essentiality, and to make them look more clearly aligned to their theme. But because metals have a shiny finish, able to catch a bunch of reflections all around, you can really play with colors as you want. This, before deep shading, weathering and highlights, is the perfect time to place the decals and make them perfectly integrated with the models. I didn't plan to include this bit in the video, but a conversation during a Twitch stream made me realize that I probably never talked about decals. The real secret for a perfect application is what I call the gloss varnish sandwich. Apply with brush or airbrush a generous coat of gloss varnish in the area of application. This will create a super smooth, texture-free, perfectly leveled base for the whole process. Then apply the decal. The use of softening and setting products is useful if you need to wrap the film over complex shapes, like the compound curves of Space Marine's shoulder pads, for example. But for something this flat, it's really a nerdy overkill. Then close the sandwich with another generous layer of gloss varnish. Not really to protect the decal, but to level its thickness and make its edges disappear into the depth of the layers of varnish. At this point, a light pass of matte varnish will fix and uniform the finish, leaving no trace of all the steps and no perceivable marks of the outline of the decal. In this project, I kept the oil stage extremely simple, with both the essentiality of the palette and a streamlined workflow. Still, it will do a bunch of subtle, little essential things in a single, almost magical step. And as a plus, it's easily usable with a batch painting attitude, even if the models are starting to be very different. As always, you don't need to varnish the models before this step. Modern acrylics are extremely tough, so they don't need any extra protection. And I want the wash to tint the previous layers, soaking a bit into the acrylics. So I don't want a barrier between them, preventing all this to happen. Using oils, we often focus on their ability to deliver precise panel lines and crisp dark details and definition. And I want for sure some of that around all the sharp edges of armors, shields, weapons and equipment. But here, I use them mostly to smooth out and connect the blocks of the quick and dirty two-stage sprayed progression of lights and shadows. Washing the models with a slightly darker version of the local tones, the natural transparency of oils, and their easy blending nature literally fill the gaps left by the quick stages and the dotty sprayed finish in a super smooth, seamless continuity. I remove the excess of paint with Q-tips and more gentle makeup sponges almost immediately after the wash to reveal all these interactions. And as a bonus, I get a bunch of interesting grittiness and fine weathering, coming mostly from the intentional use of a cheap student-grade black oil in all my mixes that leaves a bunch of cool little artifacts on the surface. If you are looking for a cleaner result, simply move to a higher quality line with a finer pigmentation. And of course, I can also apply some more intentional and controlled weathering on the largest and flattest areas. All the steps until this point, excluding maybe the colorful render of the metals, are bare bones essential to make this workflow work. But from here, the time investment and your personal commitment to details is completely based on the use you want to make of the miniatures. To make this tutorial more generally useful, and honestly, because I'm going to use these models as a warband for my games of Forbidden Psalm, I'm going for a richer, skirmish level, hero quality render of the details. But if you are painting a bunch of infantry models that will end up on a big unit, you can really stop at any point. Maybe giving priority to only one, or a few of the elements I will retouch and enhance here, with of course faces at the top of the to-do list. What I'm painting here are the extreme lights and the sharpest light definition. But if your models are not in virtual focus, you don't need most of this stuff. Or at least, not this powerful. But if you're painting a hero with this workflow, just keep pushing. The modularity of this approach is probably its more interesting and versatile attribute, especially in the speed painting optic. For For the sake of efficiency, I start working in a batch on the common elements, like skins, leather, and all the neutral, transitional elements, to then move to the more specific tones of every scheme. Again, the most important thing is not the selection of colors of the specific heraldry. That, as you can see, is always pretty standard and quite obvious. But that humble pool of warm off-white ivory that is added to every single color, mix and specific palette. As I mentioned at the beginning, I planned from the start to end on a gentle, soft, warm, desaturated light. And that ubiquitous ivory represents precisely that. Inspired by the illustrations in the book, I'm going with a similar painterly type of nervous brushstrokes that quickly break the smoothness, add an interesting textural feel to every surface, and a bunch of easily readable definition and high contrast wherever I suddenly increase the value with an extra pinch of ivory. And to close with the maximum amount of wargamey contrast literally on everything, I use a crazily reflective calligraphic silver ink to highlight just a few sharper edges and add some shiny scratches and small battle damages here and there. This stuff is liquid light, so use it tactically and sparingly. And here is the final result. I don't play Age of Sigmar at the moment, but I can totally see myself falling into the Cities of Sigmar rabbit hole. I don't want to even think about when the new The Old World Britannia and Empire will officially drop. I close the work around the 6-7 hours. But I want to point out that all the preparatory work before the brush stage in acrylics, even with all the different colors involved, took only about 2-3 hours. And then I spent the rest of the time on each single model for the higher quality, heroic detailing. But in the optic of speed painting an army with a slightly lower resolution, the working time can be cut way more. I'm super curious to see your cities of Sigmar. So let me know in the comments which is your favorite, and if you want to see more of this army here on the channel. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials, or watch me painting live on Twitch. Check the schedule of the streams on the Twitch homepage. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!